Well, good evening and welcome to Tracking the Tropics. It's been a busy week all across the East Coast. We're glad you're here with us. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina, where overnight we and many others across the state felt the impacts of Hurricane Isaias. And tonight, it's a tropical storm more than 500 miles away in New York State. But before we get into that and the very latest, check out what else we have in store tonight on Tracking the Tropics.
I'm Storm Team Chief Meteorologist Ashley Gann from Birmingham, Alabama. Tonight, I'll be breaking down how the 2020 hurricane season compares to our historic 2005 hurricane season. It's coming up on Tracking the Tropics.
It's bad. It doesn't look real, something that you see on TV. But I've been with the sheriff's office for 38 years, and I know the mobile home park, and it's like nothing is there. So it's bad. It's nothing there. You can look across the field. You can actually see the frame of a mobile home across the field. Vehicles are turned over. Vehicles are piled up on top of each other. It's just very sad.
And that was damage that you saw in eastern North Carolina. And while the headline was a hurricane impacting us, there were numerous tornadoes, and that was some of the damage done by that tornado. And tonight, look what's going on up in parts of New York. First, let's talk about the tornado that hit in Bertie County as Isaias was making its way out of North Carolina. The latest we've heard is that 2 people have died in that tornado as it struck a mobile home and a mobile home park in Windsor, North Carolina. Weather-wise, the tornado was reported about 5:15 this morning, and that's been one of the horrible things about what's happened with this hurricane and tropical storm. For so many, it has hit in the overnight hours. But what a difference a day makes. Much better weather around here. We're first going to talk about the current conditions, about what's going on with Tropical Storm Isaias. Can you believe they have a tropical storm over New York State tonight? And they have all the problems many others did. Heavy rain. They have a tornado threat, and they still have gusty winds, as this system is still producing winds in excess of 60 miles per hour. In fact, here's a live look up in northern New York State. This is Plattsburgh, New York, and you look at the lake there. Again, that's not the ocean, that's a lake, and you can kind of see some white caps, the trees getting blown around. Here's kind of what I like. It's 67 degrees, but this is a live look underneath what is now Tropical Storm Isaias. So what another historic storm this has been. It left the state of North Carolina right around sunrise this morning, and tonight it has moved up the East Coast, moving into the Northeast and New England area. The latest from the National Hurricane Center, winds actually just came down. So this is the latest 8 o'clock update. Winds are now 50 miles per hour, gusting up to 75. And it's moving north-northeast at 40 miles per hour. It has been moving at that speed for the last several hours. An incredibly fast-moving storm that has incredibly held together as a tropical storm as it's about ready to cross into Canada. An amazing storm, just to add to the list of interesting things we've had. So it made landfall in North Carolina in the southern beaches just after 11 o'clock last night. Here it is at 8 o'clock. By landfall, this would be yet another August storm to make landfall in North Carolina. So throughout history, there have now been 12 hurricanes making landfall in the state of North Carolina. That is now third all time on the list throughout history. The most common occurrences are in Texas and Florida, but now with 12 hurricane landfalls in the month of August throughout time, North Carolina moves up to third place. And if you think about it, it makes sense with Florida and Texas, but also with North Carolina because the geography of North Carolina, we kind of stick out into the ocean. So sometimes it's a little easier for us to get hit. So more history with Hurricane Isaias. It became a tropical storm at 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning. It left the state of North Carolina just before 6 a.m. as we kind of marched throughout the day. It zoomed through North Carolina, went right by our nation's capital about 10 a.m. By 2 p.m., it was around New York City, still dumping mass amounts of rain in its path. Winds held above 60 miles per hour up until just a few minutes ago, when the latest from the National Hurricane Center brought the winds down to 50 miles per hour. But an amazing storm that we were tracking now for 6 days. So it was last Wednesday that this storm got a name. And at 6 days being named, it is the longest living named storm so far this season. Last year it was Dorian, which lasted 14 days as a named storm. And now Isaias has the record, at least for now, for the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. But as Isaias begins to go away, there's one other thing we're keeping an eye on out in the Atlantic. It's not much, and we shouldn't be too concerned about it, but there it is, an area of disorganized showers and thunderstorms. I mean, you got to get close to the screen here to see it, so it's not that impressive. In fact, the National Hurricane Center only gives it a 20% chance of developing in the next 2 to 5 days. So we're not all that concerned. We can kind of take a deep breath and take a break for a minute after a busy week of tracking the tropics. And as we kind of step back and look to see what else is going on in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean, rather calm. In fact, that'd be a great time to visit. Unfortunately, and that's not really easy to do right now going on in the world. And then you look out into the open waters of the Atlantic, and there's a few showers and thunderstorms, but nothing that's showing any signs of organization. So I don't foresee us having to add another name to the list so far this season in the next coming days. But after our I-named storm, you know, it was the earliest I-named storm formation in history. Next up is Josephine. And just a story before we totally say goodbye to Isaias. You know, it's been a troublesome storm to pronounce and unfamiliar to many of us. But this is a new name to the hurricane list. Remember, we have a list of storms every year that gets recycled every 6 years, unless there's a storm that's devastating enough where the World Meteorological Organization retires it. Well, Isaias replaced Hurricane Ike back in 2008. That devastated Texas. So when 6 years went by and 2014 came around, Isaias was actually on the list, but we never made it that far in 2014. So fast forward to 2020, and here we are back to the same list we used in 2008, 2014. Unfortunately, this year, it's just been really busy, and Isaias became very familiar to all of us as a Category 1 hurricane. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, why didn't they come up with an easier name to pronounce? Well, remember, the names that the World Meteorological Organization uses to identify storms represents areas around the world that are impacted by these storms. So it's not just American names with an American heritage. It's names from the Caribbean, names from central Mexico, so it's representative of many. And let me tell you, there have been some I-named storms in history that, yes, have been easier to pronounce, but have been devastating and been retired. Look at all the retired I-named storms. So this goes all the way back to 1954 when we started naming storms. These are all the retired storms. I'll let you take a look, but Igor, there's Ike, Inez, Ingrid, Ion, Irene, Iris, Irma, Isabel, Isidore, Ivan. So we've had a lot of I-named storms retired over the year, and no telling what's going to happen with Isaias. But one thing we know is it's about to get busy in the tropics. I first want to show you the general July storm formation points. So this is a great graphic from Dr. Phil Klotzbach at Colorado State University. This goes all the way back to 1851 in July. Everywhere you see a dot is somewhere where a tropical storm or a hurricane formed. That's July. I show you that because it's a great comparison to what happens in August. Look how many more dots there are on the tropical storm formation point map in August compared to, I'll go back for you, to July. So August is kind of the real start to the hurricane season as activity is really starting to pick up. So a lot of storms will form off the southeast coast of the United States, but look how many have formed over time out in the open waters of the Atlantic. So that is a place we're really going to start to watch as we head throughout the month of August. As for how much August is in the whole big scheme of things during the hurricane season, so the percentage of named storms that we get in August throughout the whole hurricane season is 27% of the whole season. That's the second busiest month, second busiest to September, where we get 34% of the named storms throughout the hurricane season. So August is definitely busy. In fact, after August 1st, 84% of our tropical storms form. So out of the whole season, 84% of them happen after August 1st. 91% of the hurricanes form after August 1st. And out of the whole season, 95% of our major hurricanes come after August 1st. So yes, this is the real start of the season, which officially starts June 1st, ends November 30th, and this is kind of a graph showing us tropical activity throughout the year. It peaks the second week of September, but as where we are right now, 4 days into August, we are just beginning the climb of when activity really starts to peak up. So that's a look at what's going on right now and kind of our climatology about what to expect going forward. But let's get back to talking about the hurricane that hit and what a difference a day makes. Yesterday, North Carolina beaches were getting drenched with rain accompanied by wind. Now the sun is back out just like that. WJZY's Ann Wyatt, she takes us to Carolina Beach, where visitors and residents alike are already out enjoying the nice weather again.
What a difference a day makes as far as conditions are concerned. It's a beautiful beach day, but you can see just how much sand this storm pushed up by what's sitting on the railing and then down on the boardwalk. Many people here tell me they underestimated the power of Hurricane Isaias.
All the sand, all the debris.
The sooner David Cole cleans up, the sooner he can open back up. Cole is dealing with a little bit of damage at his Carolina Beach Boardwalk bar, but is thankful to have power.
We're lucky here since we have with refrigerators and freezers that we got power. So.
The storm knocked out electricity to many Monday night. Hurricane Isaias ripped apart the side of this hotel and caused minor roof damage to some businesses.
More intense than I thought it was going to be, but I think we turned out all right.
It was quite scary. I think it was more than what they predicted to be.
Anything above a Cat 1, won't stay here. So
it's worse than I expected. Yeah, I wasn't quite ready for it.
The rough night made way for a morning people took advantage of. One surfer, Stephen Albachton, woke up extra early for.
At 6, and I was wanting to get up at 6 to check the waves.
The 77-year-old started surfing in the 50s. He'll ride until the waves return to normal.
I'll give it my best try.
We'll continue with damage assessments throughout the day and the week around the island and the county. Reporting at Carolina Beach, I'm Ann Wyatt Little.
Wow, and if you think about it, how many times is the weather great the day after a tropical system? This is just another case of that. All right, we've been talking about the records this hurricane season has set so far. So tonight, we found an expert on hurricane history. Joining us now on Tracking the Tropics is CBS 42 Chief Meteorologist Ashley Gann in Birmingham, Alabama. Ashley, you did your master's thesis on hurricane history, which we can talk about a little later, but what an incredible season we're living through right now. This one is headed for the history books too, it looks like, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right, Wes. We're tracking these storms that have been evolving much of the early part of the season and actually had a preseason storm. And that is important to note because we've had an active start. And I heard you mention we haven't even gotten close to our peak yet. And that's one thing I wanted to show you just very quickly. The climatology set to peak on September the 10th. But we are sitting on the first few days of August, and we're already well into the season. We already have some of our earliest named storms of the season and landfalling storms at that. I want to go ahead and show you some of those landfalling storms that we have already seen so far this year. So you have Hurricane Hannah. We all remember that. That brought plenty of rainfall for portions of southern Texas. And then you had Cristobal, and you've got Bertha. So you can see here by the map, we've had 1, 2, 3, 4 landfalling storms, but one of those actually made landfall in the Dominican Republic, and another one actually made its initial landfall near the Yucatan Peninsula. And we have a couple of what I call fish storms that did stay out to sea, like Tropical Storm Edouard. So that's the line that you see here, kind of out in the open waters of the Atlantic. You also had Tropical Storm Dolly, which was out in the open water of the Atlantic. So that was just north of Edouard there. And what we've also noticed is a lot of these storms this year have started out impacting the East Coast. So that's a trend we're going to have to watch very closely as this storm season continues. And again, we haven't even gotten close to our peak of activity just yet.
Yeah, only August 4th. A lot of people, Ashley, have been comparing this season to 2005. That was a record season. I think we all remember that. Is that a correct comparison and a fair comparison?
Yeah, you know, I'll say 2005 was definitely record-setting. That was part of the thesis that I wrote on. Again, we can talk more about that later, but one of the things that I want to point out is how early the named storms were. So in 2005, we started to get named storms pretty early on in the season. One of the most notable storms of 2005 is Katrina. Now, you may not always immediately associate 2005 and Katrina until you say Hurricane Katrina, and people immediately know that was a big storm, and then just recalling that it was in 2005. But that storm was actually August 25th when that storm actually was named. But on the 24th, it was actually a tropical depression. And then by the 25th, it became a tropical storm. And then, of course, we know what happened after that. Moved into the Gulf of Mexico, became a strong Category 5 storm, made landfall as a Category 3. I still have my suspicions out on that one. But nevertheless, it was a fierce storm, and we all know how long that the recovery process in some parts of the Gulf Coast there, still recouping from Katrina. This year marks the 15-year anniversary for Katrina. Some other notable storms that you may not remember, because Katrina always sticks out in 2005, that were retired. I talk about those names we had mentioned earlier about those names being retired. Rita was one storm. Stan, you may not remember Stan, but Stan caused over $139 billion in damage. And then you had Wilma. So we had Katrina, Rita, Stan, and Wilma all retired just in 2005. Now, keeping that in perspective, in the last 10 years alone, just in the last 10 years, we've had 15 storms that were retired. But in 2005, we had 4 just in one single season. So 2005 definitely put some history on the map as far as some of these hurricanes, tropical systems. And what's also interesting to note about 2005 is the storms. There were actually 31 tropical systems, and sometimes I'll call them tropical storms, but not technically in the wind sense, but storms that are in the tropics. So we'll refer to those as tropical systems. There were actually 31 tropical systems, but not all of them got named. Some of them just fizzled out after they became a tropical depression, or maybe didn't even reach that, but they were a tropical area of interest, and we call that in the weather world invest. So some of them were given a number, but never really quite got a name. So there were 31 storms overall in 2005. And here's a map behind me. It looks like a mess of lines, but if you really kind of look closely, a lot of the activity in 2005, unlike the start of 2020 though, was in the Gulf of Mexico. We had several landfalling storms in the Gulf of Mexico, but not near as many on the East Coast. So I actually think that that's a pretty interesting, something that's very different, even though I think the frequency, we've already seen that the frequency of storms is actually greater. I wrote down some notes here. So our I-named storms, so we have Isaias right now, and we're on the 4th of August, but it has already been named. It was named at the end of July. And the first I-named storm to be named in the year 2005 wasn't until August the 8th. So we're actually beating 2005 as far as how soon we're naming those storms. We all know that Hannah was the earliest named storm there, and I've got a list of names here. So these storm names were the earliest named in the season. But then August 23rd, so you jump from August 8th, where we had Irene in 2005. Then you jump to August 23rd, and that's when we had Jose. And then, of course, 2 days later, Katrina evolved, and then that started to move into the Gulf of Mexico. So really, the late August storms were the ones to really watch. So we're already seeing that frequency increase. I will say the good news right now is it looks like the remainder of the tropics for us currently are pretty quiet, but that does not always denote a quiet season ahead. But again, I think it's very interesting to note one of the key differences of 2005 and 2020 is where these storms are making landfall. It's as though we're trading the Gulf of Mexico storms in 2005 for more of those East Coast storms in 2020.
Right. Well, let's talk about that a little more. One thing that is different this year compared to 2005 is the Bermuda high pressure sitting over the Atlantic Ocean. How has that made things different or steered things different compared to 2005?
Yeah, great question. And a lot of times people wonder, how do these storms go from being over Cuba, take a sharp turn to the north, hug the coast of the eastern seaboard, and then move up the Atlantic? Well, here's what really drives that. So there's a large area of high pressure. Although this map doesn't quite do it justice. See this big old H out here? Well, it's little on my map until I zoom in. But this is essentially what we consider our Bermuda high. It's always in the Atlantic Ocean. It's just that this H on the map, this area of high pressure, does move each year. It wobbles. It may move a little north, a little south, a little east, a little west. And what this is, it's like a steering wheel to a car. Just the same way your steering wheel drives your car, this area of high pressure drives storms. It's the steering mechanism that in the upper levels of the atmosphere can take control of the wind and help to steer and veer those storms. So you'll notice how closely this is actually placed to the East Coast this year. One thing I want to point out about this particular storm system as well is that we'll notice that where this is why these storms are getting scooped up kind of on the western side of this high, and it has quite a bit of control over these storms as it's pulling them closer to the Atlantic. It's pulling them into the Atlantic more. And what happens is when these storms begin to form outside of, let's say, the Caribbean. So we'll go down south near the Dominican Republic and Cuba. When these storms begin to form, this high pressure is really far away at that point. So it may not have as much influence. But if you noticed, even in Isaias, once it started to move close to Savannah, Georgia, up into the Carolinas, it's almost like it was a slingshot, and it just, this storm system moved very rapidly from North Carolina up through Virginia, all the way into New York, and now into Canada, unbelievably so. And so that ridge of high pressure really had some dominating impact as far as how it steered Isaias, and it moved it north there. But what I'll point out is this ridge of high pressure, or this Bermuda high, often if it gets moved a little bit further south, or depending on its placement, it can pull that storm more into the Gulf of Mexico, crossing through the Florida Straits, and it could make it more of a Gulf storm. So this Bermuda high has a big influence on the steering of these storms. So I think that will be something that will be very interesting to watch as this year goes on, because the area of high pressure, this Bermuda high that we have, is really a little bit further north, and that could mean that the East Coast is a little bit more impacted by some of these tropical systems, and especially as we already see, we're headed into a pretty active season. Now, I will say this, just because we have an active start doesn't always dictate an active finish, but we have to use climate and history to compare notes, essentially, and that's why we're using years like 2005. It's the closest in frequency and some of those history-making storms, so we're kind of using that as a reference. Again, it doesn't mean that it will absolutely happen that way, but I think that Bermuda high, where that's placed, is really going to change where some of these storms end up and eventually make landfall.
Good stuff, Ashley. I'm going to get you out of here on this one. I don't know if anyone remembers, but in 2005, we went through all 21 names on the list. And the way things are going, we could do that again this year. So remind us what happens after that.
Yeah, so if we make it through the entire list, A to Z, now we do leave out a few letters like Q, X, Z, just because there aren't enough letters in the alphabet for that. We start going into the Greek alphabet. So during 2005, we actually started into the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta. So we could potentially see that. That's the only time in my lifetime I've ever seen us use up the alphabet and had to go into the Greek lettering system as the naming for storms. So, yet to be told. Right now, I'm not a betting woman, but if I was, signs are pointing to an active season for me. But, again, as I mentioned before, just because we have an active start does not always dictate an active finish. We still have quite the runway of calendar left between now and the end of November, because tropical storm season or hurricane season will not end until November 30th.
Yep. See, it seems like so long away. Good stuff. That is Ashley Gann down at CBS 42 in Birmingham, Alabama. Check her out next time you are in Central Alabama. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me tonight. I appreciate it.
All right, so we led off the newscast tonight with talking about where hurricane, now tropical storm, Isaias is. It's in New York. So let's go. I want to take you up to Albany, New York, where meteorologist Tim Drawbridge is breaking down what they're experiencing up in New York tonight.
And hello from the capital region of New York State. I'm News 10 ABC meteorologist Tim Drawbridge. Yeah, Isaias was wreaking havoc across the region as we went through this afternoon. Things have calmed down this evening, but in its wake, an inundation of rainfall and some intense wind gusts, not the most intense that some of our sister stations saw in the Mid-Atlantic and down through the Carolinas, but nonetheless, this was a shot in one of the areas that typically does flood with intense rainfall. It's a location near I-90 and Central Avenue, and there was actually two small children, rescued from one of those vehicles. We also had another location that they've done a lot of work on to try to avoid a situation like this in the town of Guilderland, New York, in front of a location called Stuyvesant Plaza. Needless to say, Mother Nature still throwing a monkey wrench into those plans. It's been a dry spring and summer. Some of the roots, in particular when you look at grass, not much depth. This tree, wide base, not much depth when it comes to the roots. And needless to say, in Niskuna, which is just west of Albany, that tree came down. That was the theme, with trees coming down on power lines and blocking not only secondary roads, but some major roads as well. Here are some of the up-to-date rainfall totals. Catskills, the hardest hit, but still here in Albany, one report, the west side of town, in excess of 5 inches of rain. Even Lenoxdale, Mass, about 1 6/10 inches. And a number of storm reports coming in. Here's a few. This one from a location just southeast of Albany. Route 20 in the town of Nassau, all lanes closed due to down power lines. And then this report here, down in Columbia County, a transformer fire at a power substation. Gusts 50, Copeg down in Columbia County, up to 43 here in Albany, 39 Old Bennington in southern Vermont. Isaias continues to track to the north and east. Center of circulation up by our sister station in Burlington, Vermont, and again tracking into northern Vermont as we do speak. And after the way things went today, good riddance, but in its wake, we are getting a ton of rainbow shots. Back to you.
Amazing. That is happening in New York. How long the system's been over land, and it's still producing more than 5 inches of rain. They have a tornado threat too, and they're getting 50-mile-per-hour wind gusts. That was Tim Drawbridge up in Albany, New York. And before we say goodnight, I want to point out one thing. I often talk about the men and women who fly in the Hurricane Hunter aircraft, who fly into these hurricanes to get us so valuable information. I want to give a shout out to the men and women from the National Hurricane Center tonight, because it was last Wednesday night that a lot of us on the East Coast, for the first time, went into the cone of uncertainty. This is the National Hurricane Center forecast track last Wednesday night, right here on your left. And they were forecasting last Wednesday that Monday night at 8 p.m., last night at 8 p.m., we would have a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm somewhere over eastern North Carolina. The actual results of where the storm ended up at 8 o'clock on Monday was a Category 1 hurricane with 80-mile-per-hour winds on the verge of making landfall in North Carolina. And at first glance, you may say to yourself, well, wait a minute, that's not right. Eastern North Carolina is not just off the coast of South Carolina. But listen, that was a 5-day forecast, and they were accurate within about 20 miles per hour and about 200 miles geography-wise. That's a pretty darn good forecast. It's that kind of forecast that allows government officials and families to make decisions about vacations and what they're going to do in their lives and their homes. And I got to tell you, that's a pretty darn good forecast for 5 days out. Let's hope we don't have a forecast like that for a while. Let's hope we don't have anything to talk about for a while. Hopefully everyone did okay with this most recent tropical storm and hurricane, and goodbye and good riddance to Isaias. And that's it for us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us on tonight's Tracking the Tropics. We made it through 3 days of coverage with this hurricane. But remember, we're here every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern during the Atlantic hurricane season. We appreciate you spending part of your night with us. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm Wes Owenstein. Good night.